Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of News from a World in Flux. I'm Claire Farrell. Myself and Charlie Gardner are going to have a conversation about this COP that's happening in Dubai later this week. I thought it would be helpful to have a discussion with somebody who's been inside the process about what it's like, how it's structured, perhaps why it doesn't work, why it's failing to deliver on the thing that it's meant to be delivering on, and what it can do. So I think Paddy has some very interesting reflections on what it was like to enter that space and see how it functions, how dysfunctional it is on the front of achieving the main goal that it's got, but also the construction of it is actually extremely complicated. And I thought it'd be interesting to understand a little bit more how it's built and how it works, and importantly, why it doesn't work. Hopefully you'll enjoy this discussion. I think there are some really interesting and useful reflections on the current failure of international process. Paddy, I don't know if you want to just introduce yourself.
Yeah, I can do that. Thank you, Claire. It's great to be with you. And hi, everyone. So I have a background in commercial communications, commercial creative communications, and I left that in 2019 to work with XR, actually, and I was doing various different things, including giving the talk around the industry I was in. And then since then, I've been involved in various different bits of campaigning. I do work in what's called the narrative change field, sort of loose term, in the lead up to COP26, I got involved with a part of that process called the High-Level Climate Champions, or High-Level Champions for Climate Action, which is a slightly strange name, which I can explain. And I was then with them throughout all of COP26, which ended up taking sort of 2.5 years in the end, because we had that bit longer bit of time because of COVID. So I got to go right into the heart of that process, see it very up close, and try and have an influence on it in the roles that I was playing during that time. I'm looking forward to the conversation very much, and very grateful to Claire for wanting to have it.
Thanks, Paddy. All right, well, so what is a champion anyway? What is that whole thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's sort of, in order to answer it, we kind of need to describe who's involved altogether in a way at any COP in that process. But the way it basically works, the conference of parties means a gathering of governments. So the parties refer to the governments that are signed up to the UNFCCC, to the treaty, the Paris Agreement, that they are then mandated essentially to turn up to and be involved in. So you have these groups then within that, these voting blocks of these parties, governments, that come together to negotiate a text that at the end of each year sort of tries to further the goals of the Paris Agreement, which are basically about reducing emissions, each country doing that, according to what they should be doing, and delivering finance to developing nations. So that's the main focus, is the parties, the governments within that. You then have these observer constituency groups. So this is where the NGOs come in, basically. So where the governments are there, and you have the delegates for the governments sort of actively involved in negotiating with one another, the observers aren't there to actually get involved. They're just there to observe. They have their own events happening sort of during that period, and they have opportunities to sort of influence what's going on a bit. But mainly they're there to sort of be present and watching and commenting. So they fall into these different groups that have these slightly funny names. There's the ENGOs, so that's the environmental NGOs. There's the business and industry and NGOs, they're called Bingo. So you have NGO, Bingo, and you have Youngo, which is the youth group, Ringo, which is the research group, Tungo, which is the trade unions, and then IPOs, which are the indigenous groups, WGC, which is women and gender, LGMA, which is local governments, and then farmers have their own group. Then also have some informal NGO groups, around faith-based groups, parliamentarians, education, and comms NGOs. And as I say, none of those can actually kind of speak directly into the process, but they're there to witness it and drive advocacy in between meetings, and kind of around the edges. So they witness it, they go back into their places, and they put pressure on the parties in the interim between the meetings. And of course, between the meetings, there's a lot happening. There are these other events that happen throughout the year. There's the halfway point between a COP in Bonn called the Intersessional, basically where the agenda for the next meeting is sort of worked through and kind of arranged in advance. So you've got the parties, and you've got these observer constituencies, the NGOs. Then you have this group called the Climate Champions, the group I was part of, who were set up after Paris as a kind of a lever to put more pressure on the parties from non-state actors. So those are state actors, the parties. Non-state actors are then business, finance, cities, some of those other NGO groups you mentioned. So there's education in there, there's local governments. And the idea is that those groups, those sort of forces in society, have the ability, have some sway over what their governments locally and sort of internationally are up to. So by building a campaign or set of campaigns around those non-state actors, you can then put pressure on the parties to go further, to be more ambitious, to make greater commitments and pursue them and so on. So the Climate Champions are set up to sort of be doing that. After Paris, that carried on as a very small team. So you would have one champion from the local country and one champion from the year previous. So always two at any one time. And for most of the years following Paris, there was like a couple of people around them. They had a small kind of staff around them. But for COP26, when Nigel Topping took over the champion position for the UK and was joined by Gonzalo Munoz, who had been from Chile, but then in Madrid, who actually did that by himself because the Polish person didn't come. Those two together then had a bit more time because of COVID, and they created this much bigger team around them, in part to deliver the campaigns they conceived, Race to Zero and Race to Resilience, and eventually something called GFANS, which is finance-oriented. And so there ended up being about 100 and something people in the team, with people representing all the different sectors of industry, different sectors, different industries. It was very diverse as a team, lots of young people, 50-50 split on a gender front, and it was very very exciting team, very sort of energetic. And because there was more time, much more was able to be done, and the campaigns Race to Zero, Race to Resilience, which were basically aiming to get particularly businesses involved to say, right, we need to do more, ended up with a lot more in them than they would have fully done otherwise. So that's what the Climate Champions are doing. They themselves are not able to advocate, which is slightly weird, but they can encourage the non-state actors that they sort of are mandated to encourage to advocate to their governments into the process, etc. So that's the sort of main layout. There are then activists, other observer groups who sort of are part of that NGO observer constituency group, who can come in and be part of it, and you can arrange to have like a demonstration in these particular areas of it. At COP26 in Glasgow, that felt kind of strange sometimes. It's a bit like tube buskers, we have that like little area where like a person can busk on the tube, like, and they have a license to do so. It felt a bit like that, and it was quite easy to ignore that. The other dimension, what I've been talking about there mainly, is the blue zone, what gets called the blue zone, which is where the sort of the delegates come from the governments. It's where all those observer constituency groups hang out. It's where the world leaders come when they come at the beginning of the process and sometimes at the end. Then there is also the green zone, and the green zone is essentially publicly accessible, and lots of different things get set up there. You can apply to have a position at the green zone. It's much easier to get one than getting into the blue zone. And in Dubai right now, that's quite kind of integrated, I think, with the blue zone. Blue zone is sort of like this, and green zone is like that. It's almost like a circle. I think the access between them is quite easy. In Glasgow, it was not like that at all. You had to go across a bridge, across the river to the other side. And doing that meant having to go through all of the security to get out again and come back. And so a lot of the time people weren't going there. So that, I think, that about covers the groups involved. I'm sure I'm missing something. It's really complicated.
It sounds disturbingly quite like Extinction Rebellion to me, Paddy.
Is it?
Everyone's working in lots of different teams. They're sort of pushing the same direction, but they don't all know about each other necessarily.
Right.
Okay, so you were in that champion team when it was here, and you were working with your expertise create the messaging and the sort of narrative conditions for people to push further. But in that sort of experience of being in the system, and I know in preparation for this recorded conversation, we've had other conversations about people who've been through that process of trying to work inside. And interestingly, you sent me an article about somebody who, quit their job to go and work on COP and then quit that because it was so disappointing. I saw a quote from me on some social media that I didn't quite remember saying, but I'm sure I probably did because it sounds like me, where I just said that, COP being run by an oil boss is like peak piss take or something. It's like it feels like such a farce on so many levels because of what's going on this year particularly. But in any case, it's obviously not massively not working. Do you think there's enough what's the relationship between the two halves like, given that you've just described it as like people that have power and people that do advocacy? Does it make any difference that people go there and say the things that they say to try and push when they don't have any purchase or any access to the people who've got decision-making abilities?
I think the short answer is yes, but it's sort of, and we'll get into the dynamics of how it actually functions and why there are problems, but where the problems are. But again, it being a sort of year-round process, you definitely see the impact of people advocating for certain outcomes to the way that the final text is written, because that's ultimately what everyone is sort of wrestling with during the process, is what the final text says and what words get put into that. And the words that we can say, well, it's all just words, and people don't have to do anything with them. And to some extent that's true, because it's a treaty in the sense that everyone is legally committed to what the Paris Agreement is saying it's going to do, but the pledges that they actually come up with to achieve that are not legally binding. So there's some trickiness in there. But yeah, witnessing it, you see groups like the Climate Champions and like for some of these NGOs that are sort of putting enormous pressure on it, having an effect on what ends up in that text quite clearly. When it comes down to it, at the end, it is power that decides what's in that text, but it can have been shifted quite significantly in a particular direction. So a good example of that is happening right now with the final text for COP28. There's been a lot of discussion about wanting to mention phasing out of fossil fuels. For many countries, that is very difficult language for them to consider, and I don't just mean the oil states, the petrostates, including UAE, who are running the meeting. So, for example, the journalist here was referring to this and saying that the blanket demand to eliminate fossil fuels is widely perceived across the developing world as an ill-conceived and self-serving colonial narrative promoted by Western interests. So they really don't want that language in there. But what you've seen is a concerted campaign from some of the people I used to work with at the Climate Champions, who now are working elsewhere in think tanks like Global Optimism, which Christiana Figueres is part of, having been the author of the Paris Agreement originally when she was president of the process. And they've been pushing really hard and getting thousands of business leaders and all sorts of other people to push for certain language being included. And that language, or an element of it, has been included in the final text so far, which is about a just, orderly phase out of fossil fuels. It's just that the word phase out hasn't been used. And instead, so far, this is today, last day is tomorrow, it may change by then, but they've said that they want to reduce consumption and production of fossil fuels, which is a sort of compromise, right? But the language of just, it is in there. So it does work. Like, it does have an impact on things. People putting pressure on them, but the question is always like, well, does it go far enough? We have to come back to, like, what is this meeting trying to achieve, and can it achieve that? What is this process trying to achieve, and can it achieve that? And maybe we'll get into that. But yeah, that's the question of does advocacy impact this process? The answer is yes, for sure. I mean, one of the most sort of like clear images of this that I keep from COP26 was we would have meetings with the climate champions, with the heads of the NGOs, and we would discuss what they were struggling with, how coordination can happen between the non-state actors in the business realm and what they're trying to achieve, shared interests, and then you'd see, so particularly Jennifer Morgan, who now works in Germany, at the time was head of Greenpeace, and you would see her like in the room with Kerry and with Shu, like kind of running around, like whispering in ears, like it was real, like it was really happening, like these people were being affected by this kind of advocacy. And the presence of CAN International, which is the biggest of the ENGOs, the biggest environmental NGO in there, which represents 1,900 civil society groups across 130 countries. And it's run by Tasneem Essop. And you see her walking around in there, and it's like, whoa, like this is someone with enormous weight in the situation. It does always come down, as we've just said, to at the last minute, power deciding what is going to serve, the interests that they hold most dear. But the language does matter, because it can be used in legal situations, as sort of climate lawfare, if you like. So the advocacy placed on that language does have an impact in a positive sense.
And so thinking about that, and like who's there and what they're really doing and how the process is functioning, obviously there's a whole other set of people that are usually there who are activists and campaigners and individuals who show up. And full disclosure, I didn't even go to Glasgow because I just thought it was a waste of my time. I actually just felt like movements like XR itself wasn't set up to go to COP. It was set up to shut down central London. So it was like designed to do a different thing. And, before the Glasgow COP, I remember having conversations with people about the effect that it has on activists. And I have noticed over the years that the people I know who've been more invested in going to international conferences, a lot of people really burnt out after Copenhagen, for example, that, there's a whole amount of, there's all the pressure and the narrative of like, this is the last chance and it's the last best hope. And your last best hope is based on like a negotiation with loads of petro-states and loads of small island states and loads of, disingenuous interaction from state actors who basically don't want to see a reduction in fossil fuels, or they don't want to see it in the way that people are trying to push for. And for me, it felt so important to have a bit of this discussion about what you think activists could be doing, or whether or not you even agree with my sort of position at Glasgow, which was that I wanted to say to young people, do not place your hopes in this conference and then go there and then get burnt out, because it's not good for you. And it's a space of, of repeated failure in many ways. Like some things have been achieved, some things have been put on the table, some language has been like, put on a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. But ultimately we're losing this fight so badly. And, the conferences feel to me like they really wear people down. And so I guess this relates also to like Greta saying about, the real work being done on the outside and building things from the ground up, and activists seeing their own work as, important in its own right, separate from the conferences. But do you have a sense of the impact that it has on the activists that go there, and any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was in there myself as someone who was very close to activism at the time, and I was very lucky. Actually, a friend of ours was very generously speaking to me every morning as I was going into this thing, and keeping me grounded in that process. it's very easy to get swept up by the excitement of it when you're in there. It's like, oh, look, there's Emmanuel Macron. And like, it's like there's a lot of sort of selfie culture that happens in there. So I was lucky that I had that grounding. People get burnt out in there because it's relentless, and it's this exhausting war of attrition, essentially, against very powerful interests that are doing a good job of blocking things, and have always managed to do that very successfully. And Saudi Arabia in 1994 made it the requirement that the process be resolved only by consensus, which gave them the ability to block it every year since. And what, in a way, what's exciting this year is that that's being brought out into the open. And you might argue that it's only by holding it in a petrostate that it's possible to do that kind of reveal, maybe. But to the question of I guess as well, like whether it's worth their time going, like was it worth you going to Glasgow? Probably not. Particularly Glasgow, because it was uniquely, because of COVID, this like fortress. So in order to get in, there was one fence, and then once you're through that fence, having like shown your COVID pass and whatever else, you then had to queue for an hour across like literally a mile. Then you finally get into the system. When you're in there, there's no awareness of outside. Like it was like a spaceship. And in fact, there was one point where some activists were playing foghorn, what do you call it, air raid siren, on the other side of the river, and you couldn't hear it. Like it was only across the river, but you couldn't hear it inside. So no one was. So it's sort of turning up at the meeting itself, unless you can go inside it and be involved in the sort of the advocacy activity that happens inside it, is probably not the best use of energy. But remembering that it's not just a meeting, it's a year-long process. It's a constant process, one where advocacy is constantly being applied all around the place, is one side of it. So there are some activists who will want to be putting pressure on, the big NGOs that are actually there, to then put pressure on the parties themselves, or putting pressure directly on their governments locally, or putting pressure directly on businesses that are being roped into this as well. But then also, building the stuff that we need to come next. Because I think where I get to with thinking about this is like, ultimately, if our expectation or our hope is that this meeting can fix climate change, then we're going to be perpetually disappointed. Because it can't do that. And it can't do that because to think about it like that would be to think of climate change as the problem that can be solved, rather than recognizing it as a symptom, one of several, of a set of root causes that we have to be paying attention to and navigating our way through. They're not problems that can be solved, really. They're predicaments that we have to navigate. And on those terms, the question then that's worth asking is what role can that meeting, that process play in that context? What can be useful about that process? Accepting that it can't fix climate change, but that it can play a role somehow. What can that role be? How does it need to be improved? Like, what processes need to be added to it? What do we need to be doing around the edges of it? That's sort of where I get to. And unless ultimately we're looking at this as a recognition, and of course this is what this meeting doesn't do, that essentially our systems of modernity are inherently violent and unsustainable, as people like Vanessa Andreotti would argue, and many indigenous wisdom holders would argue. Unless we're facing that and kind of holding that as our thing to navigate, then we're not going to be getting anywhere. And of course, this meeting doesn't do that, but it can do something. What is that? That's ultimately the question, I think.
For me, the other thing that it does is that it creates an awful lot of attention on the issue of the climate, but often, I felt when COP was in Glasgow, for example, you didn't need to be there to get a media opportunity. As XR, you could easily see that there was an uptick in interest around talking about this stuff, being on the mainstream news, people focusing on it, yada yada. But the quality of the conversation through the media is not great at all, and to put it politely, and that then creates a kind of just a very limited public discourse, basically, about what the problem is, the nature of our situation. You don't even get a good read on the reality that we live in by watching the kind of coverage from that conference. And you would think that if we were in such a dire state and we were all losing the fight so badly, and it seemed so difficult to see a way that the current setup could deal with it in any meaningful or just way, that there would be, that would make something possible. Having the conference here in Glasgow in the UK would have made that more possible somehow, but it really didn't. I don't think it becomes a sort of a drama. Oh, who's releasing what bit of news, and they've made an agreement on this, they've put something in the loss and damage fund that's, someone sent me a text saying it's like less than what Man City's worth or something like that. I mean, it's just no one's been told that. They're going, oh, well done, you put some money in the pot, but it's like, it's nothing compared with what we're using to subsidize the problem. The inflation of the injection of capital is so immense into this, again, working against us, that you would think that the media could cover that if they had that information available, but they're just not, are they? So in a way, it seems really clear to me there's a geopolitical element to this, which I think we very rarely talk about in depth in the climate space. And there's a money power thing, aspect to this, which we also don't have such a sophisticated conversation about, when all we're talking about is, carbon atoms or invisible gases or whatever it is. It's sort of abstraction of it. It's actually massively, increasingly, it feels to me that it has to become something that's more political and has more focus on money and where money's going, where it's coming from, what's it doing. I don't know if you've got any ear to the ground on people with ideas for how something else could be done that has more inclusion of perhaps more focus on power literacy or something.
Yeah, I think that's, there are lots of sort of ideas about how it can, how the thing can be bolstered or strengthened or, built around. I think it's one of the biggest problems is that drawing attention to the power dynamics is difficult, because the power dynamics are so central to the whole thing. The whole thing is basically, the whole process is a sort of power game, particularly in this moment, as there seems to be a sort of, potential shift in the global, hegemony, the global kind of power structure between sort of Western and the emerging kind of BRICS, kind of Brazil, Russia, India, China, which of course now includes the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and who is jostling for what. And if you look at like what matters to the different voting blocks in COP20, in the COP process, you really see, you see the sort of dimensions of that. So for example, the USA is big focus on no more coal, tripling renewables is the way they put it, but they're very against loss and damage. The vulnerable island nations, the Oasis bloc, they're big on loss and damage and peaking emissions. China in the G77, which is actually 134 countries, they're all about loss and damage. And the EU is about tripling renewables and phasing out fossil fuels. And so you can see how there's almost sort of two sides going on there, isn't there? There's like the group that is trying to kind of hold on to its power structure, which is ultimately oil and eventually gas-based and sort of centralized power. Then there's a group that is still kind of coal-dependent and is actually doing much better on renewables, and needs money from this group to be able to sort of deal with the things that are happening now. And there's a sort of bit of an impasse there around what matters to whom. Loss and damage is a powerful reveal of the dynamics of power and money in the world, because the demand to give money to those that are, suffering at the hands of the changing climate, heating world, it exposes and would be a flip of the current arrangement, which is one of taking from those people by global north. So that itself is incredibly challenging for someone like the US to even think about. And of course, they reject it. That's why they don't support it. And that's that's horrendous, of course. And then someone like Saudi Arabia is that 80-90% of their economy is dependent on fossil fuels. So when someone talks about like going back to the caves if we get rid of it, for them that's sort of not like, that's sort of harsh language, but it's very sort of existential for them, similar to a country like Norway. So you can understand why then they are like strongly resistant to any kind of even mention of fossil fuels. So where that then comes to for us is, well, what do we do about a process that is essentially it's captured on both sides by powers that can't fully face into the reality that the wider systems of economy and politics are the root cause here, and that we need to be looking at how all of that functions and working towards radically transformed versions of those systems. If those systems are beyond reform, that we need to be doing something transformative with those. But that doing so would create a problem for both of those groups of, power holders would be power holders in the world. So it's almost impossible, it seems, to almost even begin that conversation. And so we end up in this process of, this ultimately fundamentally limited conversation that can only, it seems, discuss one tiny symptom of the situation we're in. And that wider conversation is happening, but it's happening at the edges, it's happening at the margins. And to your point, like, the risk is that the sort of climate tunnel vision or carbon tunnel vision that occurs as a result of this sort of grandstanding of this process sort of cuts away the potential space in the public discourse for that conversation to properly come through about that level of transformation. It kind of denies the potential for the honesty of that reality. And that's something we should all be working as hard as we can to be drawing out wherever we can.
I think the idea of this all being part of a big game, if you like, is something that's been on my mind, because somebody I know told me right at the beginning that another country had leaned onto the OPEC process and bumped a meeting so that it would begin at the beginning of COP, and that they thought that perhaps that move had been made to, ultimately like shame the hosts and embarrass them on an international kind of level, just at a point when they're trying to go, no, look, we're all green and grey, and look at our greenwashing. And thinking about how much influence those kinds of power games have got on an international level, and then looking at my own life and the trial that I've just been through, and how what took place in that courtroom was a game, really, of sorts. And there's an umpire sat on a higher chair, and there's people wearing wigs having this argument, and there's us lot, sort of our life in their hands, and you can see that it's this kind of game of wits. And this is a conversation that we've also had similarly about the media, how you go on a media, you get an opportunity to go on the news, and you think that you're like the girl off Don't Look Up, where you're just going like, everyone's going to die. What are you doing? Come on, take this seriously. And they're just going, no, you're not playing the game. This is a game. Like, now I'm going to make a joke. Now someone's going to ask you a really shitty question. They're going to really try and wind you up. They're not going to take you seriously. And when the cameras stop rolling, we'll all go back to our real selves and say, oh my God, thanks for what you're doing. I'm so sorry. We just have to behave like this because it's our job, because this is the game that we could bring you on. And it's not about information. It's not about educating the public. It's about entertainment. It's about creating this kind of game. And yeah, I feel more and more that the most critical areas of work that we're focusing on all have their own sort of set of rules, and there are all these different kind of games that are set up.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And they're all games that are sort of perversely incentivized dimensions of this set of systems that we might call modernity or other words that have sort of almost become like a kind of artificial intelligence at this point that is self-perpetuating, like replicating, self-defending, and where the people within that, even the most powerful, are essentially kind of just useful acolytes of that system continuing to function. And we're sort of made to play games by that in service of that system continuing. And there's a whole kind of school of thinking and sense making around like the game theory of the world and where it is. And people talk about the difference between finite and infinite games, and how a finite game is, someone wins, someone loses. And then an infinite game is something that continues constantly, and the more people playing it, the better. And the sort of better coordinated it is, the better. And one way of describing the situation we're in is that we're stuck in finite games, and we need to try and transition into an infinite game. And one way that the finite games kind of show up is like the perversely incentivized organs of power in our, in the moment, whether it's media or this, climate process or politics, that often kind of depend on division and outrage and various other things to kind of sustain themselves. The other example is the way that one of the key flaws in the whole, climate Paris process is that there isn't sufficient transparency, and it's very hard to get that transparency. So around what people are actually doing when they say they're doing something. And because that transparency doesn't exist, you end up with what gets called a multipolar trap, which is sort of like a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma. And you get what's called destructive defection, right? These are all really technical sounding terms. But what it means is like someone in the given situation doing the good thing in a sort of long-term good sense comes at a cost. But if everybody agrees to do that together and there's a level playing field, then we all accept that cost simultaneously and we do the good thing, and it's sort of level, right? Everyone's cost is sort of, or investment, right? It's sort of taken in. But when there's no transparency or not sufficient transparency, someone can do the bad thing that doesn't come with that cost. In fact, it comes with a gain. And because someone can do that in the situation, everyone else has to assume that someone is doing that and then go and do the bad thing themselves. And so you end up in this sort of race to the bottom where everybody is assuming everybody else is doing the bad thing, serving their own interests, so that and then they go and do that themselves and nothing works. And so that's like how we design around that, like how we design for the kind of coordination that will have that kind of transparency in it, that will enable us to avoid those kind of traps and shift into an infinite game, should, definitely be a kind of key priority for people thinking about this process we're talking about, and really kind of anything else. But it's really difficult. And for people like you and others, and myself, who are sort of involved in trying to make change in those things, it can be eternally frustrating to get sort of drawn into these games, and it feels so pointless and ridiculous. But ultimately, it is possible for us to sort of find a way through that. It takes a kind of resilience that I guess feels superhuman. And a lot of the time, people that have that resilience kind of are superhuman, and I think you represent that like quite clearly, like and so many others do.
There's a lot of people in our movement that I think are sustaining themselves in some kind of extraordinary way, despite the circumstances. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I worry about things like COP attendance taking up so much of somebody's, good energy.
Again, there's absolutely a conversation and detailed one about like all and I've got a list here literally of like the specifics of things that are challenging about the way that works and how they could be improved. And it's worth everybody having that conversation and all of us trying to put pressure on that. And then beyond that, like whether it's worth actually getting involved in that process to try and change it is then a sort of case by case decision. Some people might feel like, yeah, that's me. Like I want to be the one in the room where it happens, as it were, where this happens anyway. And trying to sort of put that advocacy pressure in there, in that space. Like some people love that. Some people get a lot from that. Some people have a real effect with that. Some people feel really called to that. Other people feel very called to doing the kind of transformative work in terms of developing new things, new modes of politics, new modes of economics, new modes of organizing ourselves, new modes of, lifestyle of existence, whatever. And going and building those. And other people get a lot of energy from trying to shift the Overton window with big kind of big actions that draw attention. Like these are all like necessary simultaneously. Hold your peace. But yeah, being in that space is like, it wasn't for me, right? I stepped away from the team after COP26. I didn't want to go back into that. I found it profoundly upsetting personally being in there. But for some people it's more tolerable. I think what's important is that those people who are going in there, a bit like I was during COP26, are supported by the people who, are pushing as hard as they can outside of it, I guess. So there's one way I kind of conceived of the whole thing while I was there that has really stayed with me and feels still accurate, which is that there was this, you mentioned Greta earlier, talking about the outside, like there was this real sense of like inside and outside in the whole process. And the inside, it was like the people in there, the delegates, the representatives of the businesses there, the corporate sort of power that was in there, the sort of people glad handing, wandering around making deals and stuff that was happening. And it's worth remembering there is a sort of almost like industry trade show going on. There are 360 side events and 160 exhibits that are going on at COP28 at the moment. There were 30,000 people in Glasgow. I think there's nearly 100,000. So there's a lot of stuff going on. What was I saying? So yeah, that's the inside, and then it's the power games, and it's the the hegemony kind of jostling for total domination, and it's the people trying to defend their interests and all of that. And then there's the outside, which is a lot of the people we're talking about, some of them who are in there, who are trying to sort of push for the more transformative change that's required of the situation. And the way I kind of came away sort of conceiving of that is that you had the inside game was like life, it was like the system, again, that sort of system of modernity, system of systems, the system defending itself from life. So, and there was a guy who said something after it that really kind of captured this, that sustainability consultants are not getting paid to change important things. They're getting paid to protect important things from change. So that's a bit what that insight thing is, right? It's the system defending itself from life, from the heating climate, from the sort of rising seas, all the rest of it, from the people who are rising up against that. And then on the outside, it's life defending itself from the system. And that feels like a kind of key tension in the whole situation. And in between that are people trying really hard to change the system to defend life. And that's a difficult battle. And it's one that we're all involved in.
It's something I've talked about quite a lot in terms of, because I've lectured on sustainability for a long time, and reflecting on, how it just has not worked at all. And what really goes on when you try to, I don't know what the word is, but when you try to bolt on sustainability to neoliberal capitalist industry like the fashion industry at a time like now, you can't be serious and get paid, because if you tell people the things they really should do, they're never going to do them. They'll put them out of business. So it's, you know, it's been really reflecting on the COP last year. I said to, I was talking to Jem Bendel, and I said, you know, it's like a trade show for the end of the world.
Yeah.
Just try and work out who can get what out of the situation whilst there's still something to be got before things start to really break down. And I felt like, you know, that sense around this conference and how clearly captured it is, and how, you know, being hosted where it is, with the lead being who he is, it feels really clear, like you were saying earlier, that this is really not a process which is functional in terms of what people need it to be able to deliver. And there's some parallels there with the sustainability agenda, because if you try to really have a conversation about what you should do with a globalized kind of industry like the fashion industry, you basically end up saying, well, we need to dismantle it. You can't have a trade show for it and then everyone will recycle a bit more or something. It's like the whole structure that you're trying to bolt something good onto is immovable. It's too big, It's too complex, it's too much about money, and so it's not really a conversation that you don't start from the right place when you're trying to say, let's make something sustainable. So I don't know, it feels like when I look at things like this, I always think to my industry that I know well, and it's pretty massive and it implicates everybody on earth. Everyone wears clothes, and, you know, it's a very complex industry. And if you can't see how to materially change that, then you're not really doing anything. And I feel like, you know, similarity on the statistics is like, well, 1% of clothing is recycled or something like that. It's just like, you know, it's not, we're not doing it. We're just, you know, you might talk about it, but we're not doing it. Actually, no one's really doing it. Which makes me want to ask you just something else about the IPCC process and the COP process being so. We've been critical of the IPCC process in XR from the beginning, just of its, you know, the way it's designed, the way it facilitates a sort of move to the centre and then stops you from looking at the extreme risk. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that at the moment, I've been trying to get people to pay attention to the new James Hansen paper and the aerosols and the extreme acceleration in global temperatures going up in the last few months. And one of the things that strikes me as actually very remarkable about that situation is that it would appear that, like, the IMO put reduction in place on sulfur in shipping fuels when people actually did it. So it's like, if it is caused by this acceleration in warming and a lack of cloud cover, and it's affected ocean surface temperatures and everything else, isn't it like interesting that you can put a legislation in place to make something less polluting, harmful to our health? I would have never believed that people would actually do that if you put new legislation in, especially the way things happen at sea is even more kind of out there than what people, you know, get away with on land. So I think about the CFCs being, you know, that problem also being sort of fixed on an international level to some extent. And again, it's like an issue that's environmental, where people come together and say they have to sort it out, but it's not the basis of our entire economy, is it? Like carbon is. Yeah,
and that's definitely the issue. I think that I often people mention CFCs as like, oh, we did the whole ozone there, we can do climate change. And there's two things to that. One is the whole ozone is very specific, very sort of limited in a sense, like problem. Whereas climate change is a symptom, and the hole in the ozone there was a symptom, but it was a very specific one that you could quite literally put a plaster over. Whereas climate change is this much kind of more wicked problem. Well, it's not a problem in a sense, it's this predicament, this symptom. But it's the resolution of the CFCs things that's most telling, because the way that ended up happening, the way that ended up being resolved, there were treaties, yes, and they were legally binding, and arguably that's not what's happening enough with the Paris process. But the key thing was that the substitute that they were able to arrive at for the CFCs were a hydrocarbon product. So it was expedient for the economy, for the economic system, for the power that fuels it, to switch into that. Had it not been, I struggle to imagine that they would have done it. And that's where you get into the sort of the territory of things like Ministry for the Future, which has some extraordinary ideas in it, and this sort of need to try and like offer a pathway to those who will most lose out from this, the transformational change they need to make, i.e. those in current power, those in petrostates where most of their economy is dependent on this kind of fuel, and sort of offer them like what gets called in like communications a golden gate of retreat, sort of way out that allows them to save face, to retain some kind of power and stability or whatever else. Is it possible to do that with with modernity? I don't really think it is, but the sort of, I suppose the kind of hopeful thing, and not hopeful, maybe is the wrong word, but like the sense of possibility within that is that the people who will most lose out from the transformation are those in current power. That's actually not very many people relatively, certainly compared to like all of future human history. So the often what is said is, it's going to cost you people over here too much to sort of transition. Net zero is too expensive, like all of that kind of stuff. The reality is that for most people, and obviously for those who are currently in the most existential, of positions and already losing their lives and all the rest, the transition will be better, like fairly quickly for most people. It will not be better for power. It will not be better for them. It will not be better according to the values they currently hold, the addictions they currently have, the sort of, the way that they currently estimate their value and they estimate their status. And that's the difficult bit, is can you get them out of the way to allow the sort of transformation to occur, which benefits everybody like significantly. And that's a bit tricky. But yeah, the CFCs was, I think, is an in a way it's an unhelpful precedent, because it suggests that if we get the right solution, we can make the problem go away and carry on pretty much as we were. And actually, that's not what happened in that instance. There are some basic assumptions in the way that the IPCC has sort of defined its position, in the way that then the process is talked about, that mean that those people who do turn up in there and are like, yeah, we can do this, and like, this is all going to be great, are sort of starting from the wrong place. And that's before you kind of address the modernity problem. Like, even within the kind of confines of thinking about climate change and emissions, like there are some assumptions that sort of lead it a bit astray. So maybe we talk about that for a minute. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, go for it.
So, I mean, the fact that, most of the sort of scenarios assume a level of CCUS as one, right, of carbon capture technology coming in and abating the emissions, drawing down the emissions. And there is a difference between capture and sequestration and carbon drawdown, taking it out of the atmosphere versus like stopping it getting up in there in the first place. The way around to what I just said, but yeah, either way, there is an assumption in most of the scenarios that's going to happen, and that we're going to have that technology, and it's going to be working well. And what's becoming increasingly clear is that we're not, because it's too expensive. The technologies don't really exist. They're sort of magical thinking. We're a bit late to it. Had we started this in the 90s, we might have those technologies, but it's too late, really. So that's a problem, because of course then everybody's expectations of what the worst case scenario are off by some margin, because they're sort of expecting it to be better because they're assuming this technologies are going to exist. Nigel was brilliant in all of this, and thinking about sort of exponential positive shifts. And we don't deal as humans with exponentials very well because our brains don't cope very well with 1, 2, 4. we do 1, 2, 3. So the idea of an exponentially positive shift is hard for us to imagine the same way that it is for a negative one. But even I think Nigel might have eventually got to a place of struggling to sort of see the real pathway for the development of these technologies at the scale they need to be developed. Particularly when you then factor in another thing that's missing here a little bit, which is the material blindness. Partly because the biodiversity conversation is separate in another meeting, that dimension to this is not really kind of included enough. And so when people then think, okay, well, we'll just have all this technology. So, okay, but where's the material coming from? And what about the consumption that's increasing with all of that? Like, where's the stuff coming from? And that's always been something that's pushed back against. India in particular always comes in with consumption in the West is a problem, everybody. And we go, no, really, no, I'm not talking about that. Right? And there are a lot of people in the heart of this process, in the sort of positive advocacy side of it, in the optimism sort of camp, who do believe that technology is going to sort of fix this a bit, and that's tricky. And coupled with that, then is the Nordhaus economics that came through after he absurdly won the Nobel Prize in 2018 for what is essentially, fairly evidently really bad science. And his idea that warming is good for the economy, pretty much, well, certainly not as bad as it really should be considered, has been in there as assumptions like for a while. And although there are conversations about economic transformation happening during that process, and there's all these side events and the rest of it, and now groups like Club of Rome, the original authors of Limits to Growth, are kind of having a lot of power in there. There's a legacy of that Nordhaus kind of, business as usual is fine, kind of science playing a role still. And then there's like the just sort of humanness of this many people trying to solve this many things at once, this many kind of questions at once within a process. I mean, I think where is it? Yeah, through to the end of 19, the whole process had made 763 formal decisions aimed at implementing the UNFCCC process. There's just so much, like, as Ed King said, who's someone that kind of pays very close attention to this, said it's messy and tiring, but that's what happens when you ram nearly 200 countries into a room and ask them to solve an existential crisis. And it really feels like there's just so many people right, trying to kind of jostle and kind of understand it. And so that's then like a part of the next part of the problem, which is the process itself requiring consensus, unanimity. So any one actor can say no, and that scuppers, that stops the agreement happening. And of course, Saudi Arabia's done that a lot. Russia's done that a lot. And when you look at how dependent the US is on the relationship with Saudi Arabia, even from the point of view of the number of weapons it sells to them, it becomes really complicated really fast. And in the end, the person can bang a gavel and sort of like say there's been an agreement when actually maybe there hasn't been. So a little bit what happened at COP26, where they last second switched the text to bring in phase down instead of phase out of coal. And that was a backroom deal done between the US and China and India. And we literally saw that happen in the room. Like they walked off and they came back and then it's changed. Like, I mean, it's a weird kind of decision-making process. And in fact, it isn't a decision-making process in a sense. Like what happened in 1994 with Saudi Arabia insisting that it's consensus-based meant that the process for deciding, for making decisions together is still, I think this is right, it's still in draft form today. So technically they haven't even decided how to decide. So like, how do you get on with that? And then just the last thing is the power, like who represents the power. There's of the group of power leaders, I'm sure everyone's seen that team photo of the world leaders, and there's like 14 women out of 140 leaders or whatever it is. There's drastic lack of female power in the sort of female representation in the power that is sort of leading the whole thing. And the imbalance there's the differentiated responsibility problem of, while these guys have been doing it for longer, the US, Europe, they have more responsibility for reduction. China and co are coming through, they haven't done as much damage, but actually now that's changing, so we have to look at that now. It makes it very difficult for them to sort of make decisions. And this, I'll stop talking in a second, but this one last fact really kind of was so revealing at the COP in Glasgow. Every world leader gets a moment to speak at the beginning, and you get 2 minutes. Right, there's a 2-minute slot. That's all your time, except for the US. The US can talk for as long as it wants. And Biden was there with 50 cars driving around, and at one point they had to shut down the whole of a big street in Glasgow at a moment's notice, to the extent that people had crossed the road to pick up their kids from school and then couldn't get back home again without going like a couple of miles round. So there's this, there's a sort of a power imbalance. It's sort of this image of democratic process, but actually it's difficult. And there was, I can't remember who it was, I think it was Erdogan, refused to turn up because he wasn't allowed to bring tanks. One other one, which is the fact that the decisions that are ultimately sort of wrestled over, many of which have sort of been decided in advance, it's just kind of fine-tuning things at the end, are done in like basically windowless rooms, people eating stodgy food, sleeping under the desks in there. Like, how can you make decisions based on that? Like, this kind of, ideally this needs to be like happening in the woods, like people need to be spending time together properly, and they need to be, better fed and watered, and they need to be making decisions based on intuition, not just sort of hard rationality. But that isn't really made space for. You do have some monks wandering around though, and having chats with people occasionally.
President Biden sounds more disruptive than Just Stop Oil to me. So
Exactly. Yeah,
that's one thing, isn't it? So I just wanted to just ask about one more sort of big picture thing before we close, which is, I've been looking at this for quite a few years as with a sense of, particularly if you think about it in a game theory way, that there's like people with their elbows out and they're like push for like the best deal. Everyone wants the best deal, and people want the best deal for them because they are still growing coal, or the best deal for someone else because they're a petrostate, or the best deal for someone else because they need the loss and damage fund to have some money in it because they're getting hit and no one's helping them or whatever. But the purpose of the major players that can really derail the direction of travel internationally, it strikes me that they are constantly pushing in a negotiation sense up. And to me, the old frame, I guess it's an old frame from the environment space, from like before I was even aware of what I was going to do or what the state of the world was. Well, I think back to like the lens being Greenpeace, being green and peace, that it's this like non-proliferation story of scaling down from harming one another, and for de-escalation, a sense of like peacemaking, non-proliferation being like an aim rather than getting the best deal, making the most money being the main aim. Do you think that negotiations could ever be repurposed in the sort of spirit of peace talks almost, rather than negotiating each other up?
It's such an interesting question. In given that at the moment the thing is essentially a sort of space where the global conflict or the global power struggle is carried out, that feels difficult. But to sort of animate the vast amount of people that are involved in trying to make this do something good, to animate them around that idea feels interesting. And when you look at like the suggestions that people make for how this could be improved, whether it's like building more participatory, sort of public participatory processes around the thing as a mode of that advocacy, whether it's something like Global Assembly that was very successful at COP26, or someone was suggesting bringing in what's called border count voting instead of a consensus-based voting system, BORDA, which would be a fair way of covering all those different interests that you just rightly described, and which would allow the meeting to continue to be what it needs to be for some of the most kind of threatened to nations, or whether it's like taking elements out of it to have sort of ongoing focuses throughout the course of the year that are kind of working very specifically on, say, deforestation or agriculture or kind of transport, and in a way that's already happening, but kind of making that more official. That sort of idea of de-escalate, I think that the challenge of it is kind of revealed in the language that so often gets used around running out of time, racing, like so Race to Zero, for example. That was the campaign that I helped to create the strategy for and the design and all the rest of it, and like it was language that already existed, and now I think about it, I'm like, well, but hang on a second, like surely if you like, even just with the metaphor of racing and zero, if you're trying to get to zero, you slam on the brakes, right? You don't race. But the logic is again, it's a sort of progress logic that is so a product of modernity. And how can we kind of come to the place of recognizing that it is only through reduction, it is only through, as you put it, de-escalation, both of the kind of finite gains and also of the pressure we're putting on our system, our kind of life support systems, that we're going to be able to to sort of get through to anywhere viable and livable and the rest. That's it feels like a very hard thing to sort of bring into there. There's a beautiful quote from Rumi, the poet. It says, I'm going to paraphrase it, I think, but you are drunk and you are standing on the edge of the roof. Sit down. It's like how do we, the question of how do we help people in that process recognize the urgency of slowing down is a really good question. And I can imagine that what many of them would say is that, but if we slow down, then they will speed up. That will give them space. Then, the people who are activating for the most destructive outcomes that will serve their very short-term interests, it will give them more space. And I think that ultimately is the challenge with this whole thing. It's like, how necessary is it for that space to even exist, for that pressure to be being, that holding action, to use Joanna Macy's language, to be being kind of carried out. I think we think of COP as like a transformation, as part of that great turning model, transformation space. It's not really, it's more of a holding action. And the fact that it was in a petrostate this year is really interesting. It gave the opportunity for that strategy you mentioned earlier of calling out and shaming, people in the UAE who want to look good on the global stage, to force them into a position of doing sort of the right thing. And the fact that the text has the word fossil fuels in it only 3 times is ridiculous, but it has it 3 times many more times than it had in Glasgow. And it's happened in a petrostate. So there's something interesting in that. But yeah, to think about how we animate the sort of the people doing good in there, about the idea of de-escalation and reduction, of helping them find ways to do that don't allow the sort of the most destructive forces to just get stronger, feels like a really critical question, a really critical kind of inquiry to urgently pursue.
Yeah. Well, we're stuck in a game, aren't we, where there's a Pyrrhic victory. I got really into thinking about that a couple of years ago. The only way that you win all out in this is that you destroy everything. And I was on a panel the other day with a philosopher who's written this beautiful piece of work, and he writes. His name's Muhammad, and he wrote this piece, and it says, the earth never asked to bear the burden of heaven. And what I took from what he's writing about is just that if you try to make everything, have everything, dig up everything, extract everything, create everything. And it's, you know, it's all about what you can produce and what you can turn over. And if you think that you're going to create this kind of, you know, immense scale of like supposed abundance of all of this stuff, you just end up with nothing, basically. And you've just surrounded with shit, and you've actually got nothing at all in the end. And that's what I kind of feel like in this moment, to be honest, especially with my, you know, my background in fashion. It's like you can make 100 billion garments a year and you will just end up with nothing at all. So the other thing I think that's really telling to me at the moment about our sort of moment that we're in is that I think a lot of people really are aware of the sort of gross consumerism and vast waste and everything, and it's strange that it was kind of part of the story of what played out in our trial was, you know, there were 2 or 3 members of our group of defendants who were women, who were mothers, grandmothers, and they're just describing their horror at the way their children had been advertised to, the way that the stuff that they'd acquired had all ended up in landfill, the way that they'd had this rampant sort of turnover of like stuff that like comes into your life when you have a family, and the children being sort of marketed to and everything like that, and wanting to really protect them from the economy in a way. And you could see jurors going, yeah, I agree, like I don't like it, you know, people don't like the idea of churning everything through and blowing the whole of civilization apart in the process of just wasting everything. It's so there's something very old about some of the things that I think are valuable to think about right now, you know, the sort of the lens of peace, the lens of not wasting stuff, the sufficiency of like having the things that you need and not needing to have, you know, so much of everything. But
just 2 words that capture that idea in a really lovely way. It's a slightly kind of nerdy way maybe, but it's the idea of avant-garde nostalgia. Like the idea that we need to retrieve things from the past that have worked, going all the way back, like to sort of pre-modernity, to kind of carry forward and through into something that is viable and beautiful and livable and all the rest. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Paddy. Thanks for joining us. It's very helpful to have that insight on like more first-hand knowledge about how things work inside there, just to demystify it a little bit and understand it a bit better. So sorry, it's a bit of a serious and sad conversation, but I'm very grateful for you being and having it with me.
I can only bring a sort of sliver of the view of it, but hopefully that's some helpful understanding. And as I say, like it's not, if we think it's going to solve the problem, it can't, but it may have some role to play, and getting rid of it altogether, for example, you know, may lead to consequences we don't anticipate and don't want. So what can we do around the edge? What can we do through it? The main important questions, I think.
Brilliant. And what can we build that's ours?
Exactly. Yeah. Not the infinite game. Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much, Paddy. And thanks everyone for listening. If you've made it to the end, big respect.
Yeah.
Speak to you soon.
Thanks.